in the first study session, Basic Concepts, with the overview of bonds, sectors, and instruments. And you'll find this to be mostly institutional detail, although some of it gets a little bit intricate, and there's some intuition behind what we're doing that is going to be very fundamental to the valuation process, both as we move into the rest of the material at level 1 and certainly at level 2 also. So this is, while it is a little dry, of course this is CFA land, so everything is kind of dry, right? Anyway, so it is a little dry, but there are some important concepts in here, things you want to make sure that you are on top of. So we'll start out in terms of sectors. Well, the government sector is one of the prime sectors that you can look to for different types of credits. When we talk about sovereign debt, as we said previously, this is debt issued by federal or national governments, and it can be in many currencies, all those types of things. Generally, and we're still going to call it this way because it's what it says in the curriculum, the U.S. Treasury securities are considered to be free of default risk. The U.S. government issues all of its securities in U.S. dollars, of which they control the supply. They also have an army that can collect taxes and those types of things. So they have very little, if any, foreign currency issued stuff. So this is considered to be risk-free. All other sovereign borrowers are thought to have varying degrees of credit risk. I realize that with the U.S. government budget policies, people are starting to wonder about this. This isn't the place to speculate on it, so we just need to know what's going on with with what is in the curriculum. So what about sovereign debt issuance methods? Okay, we can have a regular cycle auction where we do it at a single price. What that means is we have an auction on a regular cycle. If it's the United States, we do it every week. So we sell something every week. It's not everything we sell every week. But anyway, this is where the highest price or the lowest yield at which the entire issue can be sold is awarded to all bidders. So everyone puts in their bid, and then everybody essentially gets the same price or the same yield on the securities that are floated that day. We could also have multiple prices, that is where we'd let people bid, and the winning bidders would receive the bonds at the prices at which they bid, and so some people would get higher yields, other people would get lower yields, and of course if you tried for too high a yield, too low a price, you wouldn't get anything at all. That's the incentive to stay up in the top. Okay, we can have an ad hoc auction system. This is where the government auctions new securities when the market conditions are advantageous. So governments that don't rely a lot on external debt would be able to get away with this. There's also something called a tap system, and this is the auctions of bonds which are identical to previously issued bonds. So we already know what it is exactly we're going to issue, and you can think of the name tap system as turning on the tap. So we're going to turn on the tap whenever we think we can sell the bond. So there's no regular cycle here, but we know exactly what we're going to be selling. Let's think of U.S. Treasury securities. Of course, there's a lot of them floating around out there. Well over $10 trillion worth of these. Anyway, they come in several varieties or several forms. And you need to know something about the way these securities are issued. They're an important part of the credit markets worldwide in the sense that they're integral to the pricing process, and you're going to be expected to know some of the underlying details of these bonds on the exam. So thinking of T-bills, these are pure discount securities. What that means is there's no interim payments. You buy it today for $990. It matures in a few months or a few weeks at $1,000. Okay, so there's no interim payments on a treasury bill. So there's no coupon, no interest payments, and they have less than 1 year to maturity. If there's something longer than that, 2 years to 30 years, we call those either notes or bonds. I don't think there's a lot of difference between T-notes and T-bonds. Basically, the T-note is 2 to 10 years. The T-bond is greater than 10 years, but they behave the same in the sense that they both offer semi-annual coupon payments. That's based on par value times an interest rate. Then you divide that by 2, then they repay their face value. They repay their face value at maturity, which can, of course, be as long as 30 years. Okay, there is a little more unique animal here in the TIPS. That stands for Treasury, Inflation Protected Securities. Now, previously we were talking about the attributes of bonds or bond risks. We talked about floating rate bonds, and the floating rate bond, the idea was that the bond holder doesn't bear as much interest rate risk. So if interest rates go up, the coupon rate on the bond goes up. Interest rates go down, excuse me, if interest rates go down, the coupon rate on the bond goes down. So it is not the bondholder that bears the interest rate risk as it is with a fixed coupon bond. Well, this is another way to shift the interest rate risk from the borrower to the issuer. That is to have these TIPS or Treasury inflation protected securities. But remember, they do not have a variable coupon. The coupon rate is fixed, and that is intended to be a real return. So what we change, instead of changing the coupon rate, is we look at what happens to inflation. Price level goes up by 2%. Then we increase the par value by 2%. Next period, price level goes up by 1%. Then we increase the par value by 1%. And the coupon rate is just going to be half of whatever the fixed annual rate is times the inflation adjusted par value. That's what they're going to pay every 6 months. So this is like a floating rate note. Okay, but here the coupon is fixed and the par value adjusts. And this is something that some college professor somewhere found that would be a better adjustment mechanism. And when the U.S. Treasury decided to start issuing variable returns or securities that took into account the fluctuations in interest rates, this was the way they decided to do it. Okay, what about the distinction between on-the-run and off-the-run securities? Well, remember, we're issuing securities in a bunch of different classes. So every week we're going to issue the 30, the 90, and the 360-day T-bills. And then we're also going to issue at regular intervals the 2-year, the 10-year, and the 30-year securities, or something along those lines. That changes from time to time, and that may not be exactly right even today. But nonetheless, we're going to, every week or every month, we're going to be issuing new securities. Well, the most recently issued security in any maturity class is the on-the-run security. So if we're looking at 1-year Treasury bills, those get issued every week. And then what we'll see is that for 1 week, those will be on the run. After that 1 week, we'll come in behind them and issue some new ones. Okay, then those will, the old ones will be off the run, and the new ones that were just issued will be on the run. So the most recently issued securities in each maturity class are the on the run issues. The others are the older issues, and the idea here, and we really don't talk about it in the curriculum, but the on the run issues are the most accurately priced. They're traded very vigorously to begin with. Eventually what happens to lots of bonds is they find their way into a portfolio and they sit there for a couple of decades. Okay, but the on-the-run issues have the very most accurate pricing. The off-the-run issues, if you're talking about the United States Treasury market, well, the off-the-run issues are still probably pretty accurately priced, just not as accurately as the on-the-run issues. What about a stripped Treasury security? All right, so a stripped Treasury security, well, why do we call these things coupon bonds? Right? Well, if you think back to the pre-computer era, actually this is going back even farther than the advent of good computer equipment, but nonetheless, a bond would be issued and it would literally have coupons on one side. So you would get to the point where you're supposed to receive a coupon payment, you would pull off that little coupon, you would send it into the company, and they would send you back your coupon payment or your interest payment. So that's why we call those coupon payments, and that's why we call that a coupon bond. Well, think about a 30-year Treasury security, and while they certainly don't have coupons on the side anymore, it makes for a good intuitive story, and that is, what if we looked at the coupon stretched out over 30 years? If we come down here and we said, well, here is the coupon that entitles the holder of this bond to receive a payment from the United States government 23 years from today. So it's a single coupon that we have stripped off of a Treasury coupon security. Well, we could take that individual coupon and we could sell that into the market. Okay, effectively that is a zero coupon bond that has one payment 23 years from now. We can create those either with coupon interest, okay, that would be denoted as a CI, okay, or the principal that's coming 30 years from now, if it's 30-year bond, that would be the PI. So we have principal and interest bonds here. So this is going to be a way to create zero coupon Treasury securities. Now the Treasury, the United States Treasury, does not issue zero coupon bonds, okay, but they do facilitate this process. So you can get a smart investment banker somewhere that'll strip off all the coupons and sell these zero coupon bonds. You can then register it with the Treasury, and the Treasury will facilitate all the payments and those types of things in the future. So we have these strips that are out there. They represent zero coupon Treasury securities. They weren't that way at issue, but they're converted into that. Okay, they're actually taxed on the implicit interest. So if I buy a coupon that's going to entitle me to receive, let's say, $1,000 23 years from now. I'm going to pay, $100 for that today or something along those lines. Okay, well, I'm going to be taxed on the implicit interest. So these are, in fact, negative cash flow securities because I have to pay taxes every year on the interest I've earned, even though I haven't actually received any cash flows from that. All right, so anyway, stripped securities, both principal and interest strips are available. So looking at securities issued by federal agencies, well, there can be federally related institutions like Ginnie Mae. We can have government-sponsored enterprises. That means the tie between the government and the agency or the enterprise is less formal. So theoretically, anyway, the government could walk away from Sallie Mae or Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae. Now, of course, we know from experience that they're not likely to do that, and we actually didn't expect them to. But government-sponsored enterprises always had that little extra risk. So Ginnie Mae is essentially part of the federal government in the United States. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were essentially related enterprises that the government has indicated that they are likely to bail out, but that they would not necessarily be obligated to. There's also agencies, something like the the Farmers Home Loan something or other. Well, these are actually agencies of the federal government that have the authority to issue bonds directly. These have very little credit risk, so very small spread, if any, above a United States Treasury issue. And then these are all issued as debentures. Don't get that word confused with indenture. Indenture is the contract under which we issue a corporate bond. A debenture is a security that's not backed by specific collateral. So these are unsecured bonds. So almost, I guess everything that's issued by the United States government is effectively a debenture since we don't pledge any specific collateral associated with those bond issues. Okay, what about a question here? So a TIPS problem. So U.S. Treasury inflation protected securities or TIPS have inflation adjusted coupon rates. B, have a par value that changes over time. Or C, can be worth less than par value at maturity. Okay, they're actually protected from going down in value if we were to have deflation. Okay, but they have a par value that changes over time. It is not the coupon rates that change with TIPS. It is the par value. That's the big difference. Make sure you keep that in mind. Let's look at an amortization schedule here in preparation for talking about mortgage-backed securities. So when we talk about a mortgage, so this is the individual mortgage that you can have for someone who's buying a house. So a mortgage, of course, is debt issued where the security is real estate. So lots of different kinds of mortgages. Let's think of this as a residential mortgage. That is, we have an individual who has borrowed money to purchase his or her primary residence. So the typical instrument used to finance that in the United States is a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, so 5.75% in this example over 30 years. And here we're going to use a principal value or a loan value of $100,000. If you happen to live in Utah like I do, then you can actually buy a house for $100,000. If you're talking about California or maybe New York, that's probably just the mailbox, but nonetheless, you get the idea. So we could multiply that by 10 and get $1 million, and everything would just be tenfold bigger. Of course, the problem with being in Utah and buying a $100,000 house is at the end of the day, you live in Utah and not California, right? Anyway, what does that mean? Well, if we use our time value of money skills, so we go in and we take 5.75, we divide it by 12, put that as in the interest rate, 360 months, put that as in as the N, $100,000 is the present value, and calculate the payments. What we're going to get on these mortgage payments are $583.57. Now, if you're saying, what did he just say? Okay, that means that you haven't been working with your calculator enough. Remember, time value money calculations on your calculator have to be like breathing, right? That just has to be something you don't even think about because you're going to be doing it so much as you go through the 3 levels of the exam. So anyway, looking at here, we've calculated the principal and interest payment to be $583. We've talked about amortizing versus non-amortizing loans several times. Remember, this is an amortizing loan. What you're going to do is you're going to make 360 equal payments. Each one of those payments is going to be $583.57. Some of that is interest and some of that is principal. Once you've made 360 payments of $583.50, you will have paid all of the principal and all of the interest owing on that loan. So this amortization schedule gives us the scheduled principal payments, all right? So if we go in and we look at this, we're going to start with a $100,000 loan. We're going to be borrowing at 5.75%. well, in 1 month, if we have a 5.75% annual rate, so we take 5.75% divided by 12, multiplied by a $100,000 principal, then what we're going to get is an interest payment in the first month of $479. That's a little discouraging. You make a $580 payment and $480 is interest. That leaves the other $100 roughly as a principal reduction. So what happens? Well, the first month at time 0, you borrow $100,000. You make a payment at the end, 1 month in. Okay, you get $104.41 in principal reduction. So after your first payment, your mortgage balance goes down to $99,895.59. So that's the amount of principal that you have to pay interest on in the second month. So notice that while it's a fairly small impact from 1 month to the next, what you see is that the interest payments are going down through time. Why? Because the principal is getting smaller, and then the principal payments are going up through time, so that when you make that last payment, almost all of it is principal reduction, right? Hey, well, remember that this third column here is what we would call the scheduled principal payments. The problem with this is we're about to start talking about mortgage-backed securities. That's where we're going to take a lot of these little individual assets and we're going to securitize them. We'll talk about it on the next slide. Okay, the problem is that I have a mortgage on my house. I do this very thing. I make payments every month. Some of it is interest, some of it is principal. Okay, but I could also choose at any time I wanted to prepay my mortgage. So we have scheduled principal payments and we have prepayments of principal, and that prepayment is going to be a really big deal that we're going to have to work with, primarily at level 2, but we're going to talk about what it is and where it comes from here. All right, so that is an amortization schedule. Make sure you could do this for 1 or 2 or 3 years out, just to make sure that you understand how these things work. Now let's talk about mortgage-backed securities. And so a mortgage-backed security, the simplest kind is called a mortgage pass-through security. And here's what we're going to do. So if you think of an individual mortgage, the mortgage on my house, okay, well, it is an asset to somebody. It's a liability to me. It's an asset to some bank somewhere, okay, but it's not a security, right? So, I mean, they're receiving payments from me, but it's not a security because you can't sell that easily in the secondary market. Why? Because, every piece of real estate is by definition unique. All the borrowers are a little different. Some have a little higher credit score. Some have a little lower. Some have higher loan-to-value ratios. Some have lower loan-to-value ratios. You have all these different things. And if you're talking about a mortgage that's $100 or $200 or $400 or $600,000, it's just too small to do anything with individually. But what we can do is we can buy a bunch of these. Let's call it $100 million. That's too small, but that's a good number to work with. We'll call it $100 million worth of mortgages. So we're going to go out and buy mortgages till we get $100 million worth, and we're going to put them all in a bucket, okay? And then we are going to sell off an undivided interest in this pool of mortgages. So if you buy 1% of the pass-through securities out of this particular mortgage-backed security issue, then you don't buy any particular mortgage. What you get is 1% of all the interest that comes in, 1% of all the scheduled principal payments that come in, and 1% of all the prepayments of principal that come in, less a little servicing spread, but we're not going to talk about that in the level 1 curriculum. So anyway, so it's a pool of mortgages that's used to support the issuance of securities. This is called the securitization process. Okay, so and it's been a great boon for homeowners in the United States, and it's worked very well for a very long time, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Now, when we talk about the CDO market and some of the things that were used, some of the securitization processes that were used there, obviously we have seen problems with those in the past, but the standard pass-through CMO environment has been very stable and continues in fact to be very stable. So a mortgage pass-through security, that was the original type of mortgage securitization. The problem with that is this prepayment risk. So if interest rates go down, then people refinance and I get a lot of my money back. If interest rates go up, then they actually slow down their principal prepayments. Why is that? You've never heard anybody say, hey, hun, interest rates are up, let's build the new house. Okay, which would require selling the old one, right, and paying off the old mortgage. So when interest rates go up, okay, prepayments of principal slow down. When interest rates go down because of refinancing, prepayment of principal goes up. That means there's lots of uncertainty, not in the volume of payments that you're going to receive, okay, but in the timing of those payments, all right? So what we can do is we can turn around and make CMOs, or collateralized mortgage obligations. These are actually created from mortgage pass-throughs, so we take the pass-through securities and we use those securities to securitize the issuance of the collateralized mortgage obligation. And what we're going to do is we're going to reallocate the risks associated with the payment stream. Now, the risk is what it is. There's nothing we can do about that, but we can reallocate it to different parties through what we're going to call different types of bonds or categories, or in the language of the industry, tranches. Now, don't worry about the tranche word. All that means is it's a bond or it's a category, something like that. But we're going to create tranches that are going to have different risk characteristics. So the initial type of CMO that was originated, and still what is the most simple, is called a sequential pay tranche. So here's what we could do. We could take our $100 million worth of mortgage pass-through certificates, and we could break them down into three groups, A, B, and C, okay, also calling that short, medium, and long. And what we're going to do is we're going to assign a coupon rate to all three of those tranches or categories, okay, and they will all receive an interest payment, but all of the principal that comes in, whether it's scheduled or a prepayment of principal, will go to the short tranche, and they will slowly be paid off, and then they will be paid off completely and out of the picture. Once tranche 1 is paid off, then we're going to direct the cash flows into tranche 2 until they're completely paid off. Then we'll direct finally the cash flows or the principal payments into tranche 3, and they will be paid off last. What that means is if interest rates fall and prepayments come in quick, then the short tranche is going to bear most of this prepayment risk early on. On the other hand, if interest rates go up and stay up, then the lengthening of the time of the cash flows, which we call extension risk, so the shortening is called contraction, the lengthening is called extension risk. Well, it is tranche 3, or the long tranche, that takes most of the extension risk. It is tranche 1, or the short tranche, that takes most of the contraction risk. For me, I am a fairly long-term retirement saver. So I'm not, if I get my payments in, 12 years or 15 years, that doesn't make too much of a difference to me. I'm a very long-term planner, but I don't want my payments next week. So I'm the kind of person that would not buy a short tranche, but that would consider a long tranche. So what this has done is it's reallocated the prepayment risk so that parties that are less sensitive to a particular type of prepayment risk can bear that risk. So I'm not very sensitive to extension risk, so I would be a tranche 3 candidate, and I would pay more for a tranche 3 than I would just for a pass-through security. So of course what we're doing is we are increasing the value of these cash flows through time. All right, so this prepayment risk, again, we've talked about this for the most part already, but the risk of receiving principal repayment in excess of the scheduled principal payments, okay, this leads to more funds to be reinvested when interest rates are low. When interest rates are low, that's when everyone pays off their mortgage. That is, these things have lots of reinvestment risk. When interest rates increase, prepayments slow, already said that, okay, that's extension risk. So rapid prepayment, it results in gains for the PO side. Rapid prepayment decreases cash flow from the IO strips. So what we could do, we didn't talk about it, but we could take the mortgage securities and say, well, rather than giving everybody principal and interest, we could give one party principal, the other party the interest payments. Okay, well, what happens is, if you look at the principal side, okay, so it's $100 million in principal. You know you're going to get that back. You just don't know when. You pay $60 million for that today. Okay, well, what you would like to see is you would like to pay $60 million for the $100 million PO side, principal-only strip, and then tomorrow wake up and find that the Fed has driven interest rates down to 0%, so everyone will prepay their mortgage, and you'd get $100 million in tomorrow. So the prepayment gains, the rapid prepayment results in gains for the PO. That means if interest rates fall, the PO wins. Okay, and likewise, if interest rates increase, okay, the IO, or the interest-only side of that, is going to win. So the motivation here, of course, we've already really talked about this also, but that's to alter the maturity range and redistribute the prepayment risk to make securities more attractive to different classes of institutional investors. So we don't alter the cash flow risk overall, but we do reallocate it. So tranche with the less prepayment risk, another way to do this is we could do a tranche that has just low amount of prepayment risk. That's called a PAC, or a planned amortization class tranche, planned amortization class tranche, a PAC tranche. Okay, well, we could do that and say, well, here, you're going to get these payments, But then how do you deal with the risk of the underlying cash flows? Well, you deal with the risk of the underlying cash flows by coupling that with what's called a support tranche. So you have a support tranche. You have one group of investors who says, look, if interest rates go down and money comes in quick, then we'll take our share of the contraction risk and your share of the contraction risk. So they're going to be very much exposed to contraction risk. If interest rates go up, well, then they go to the other side and they say, look, we'll take our share of the extension risk and your share, Mr. Pack, of the extension risk. So the support tranche is going to double down on the variability of the cash flows so that the Pack can have a very even or very well planned series of cash flows. Now, of course, these have to be priced in the market, and no one's going to accept extra volatility without being compensated for it. So the support tranche has a higher expected return, but they also have, of course, greater uncertainty. And the goal here, of course, is to lower the overall cost of funds, therefore making money for the clever investment bankers who put all this together. Okay, what about state and local government issues? This is primarily a discussion of state and local governments in the U.S. So when we talk about state and local governments, they can issue what are called municipal securities, okay, also called munis. Okay, and these bonds are exempt from federal taxation. So if you live in the state of California, you buy a state of California bond, okay, then the interest you receive on that will not be taxed by the U.S. government. And if you live in the state of California and buy a state of California bond, then the state of California will also exempt the interest. Now, if you live in California and buy a Utah bond, then most states do not exempt the interest on other states' bonds, but nonetheless, that's probably more detail than you needed. Anyway, so these are muni bonds. The big deal is that they're exempt from federal taxation. There's two kinds here. There's tax-backed bonds and revenue bonds. Tax-backed, also called a general obligation bond, okay, well, those depend on the taxing authority for repayment. So they are supported by the collection of taxes. That can be the city of California, they could be the state of California, the city of Los Angeles, and where I was going was Los Angeles Independent School District. All of those are taxing authorities. They can all issue muni bonds. Okay, a revenue bond does not depend on the taxing authority, but rather depends on the revenue generated by a specific project, something like a toll road. So if the state wants to build a toll road, they can issue revenue bonds against that, and the revenues collected on the toll road will pay for the bond issue. So this is debt serviced only with the specific project's revenues, okay, and they're not depending on the general taxing authority of the issuing entities. Okay, so what about special types of munis? Well, an insured bond, this is just one where the issuer has gone out and bought insurance. Well, that says bond insurance, so it's probably AAA rated, and that means that the bond insurer has supplanted its credit risk for the credit risk of the issuing municipality. There's also something called a pre-refunded bond, which I always thought was a terrible term, but nonetheless, here's how it would work. So let's suppose that you are working on a city government project. So you sit on city council, you work for the city of Los Angeles, and you are anticipating some issuance of new bonds this year in order to fund some sort of new public works project. That's what I was trying to say. Public works project. Well, what if you had some other bonds that were going to mature 3 years from now? Well, if you have those bonds on your balance sheet, then that's going to increase the amount of debt that the municipality has, and it's likely to decrease your bond rating, which will mean that you're going to have to pay a higher interest rate. Well, what you can do is you can refund those bonds. Pre-refunding means that you are going to take some United States Treasury securities, you're going to put those in escrow in sufficient amount to make all of the remaining payments on those previously issued bonds. Okay, well, that is a pre-refunded bond. The reason you would do that is to get them off your balance sheet for credit analysis purposes. So you didn't actually pay off the bond early, but since you put in Treasury securities, which remember are considered riskless, into an escrow account that's sufficient to cover all of the remaining payments, okay, well then it is like paying those off early, a pre-refunded bond. What about corporate debt? This is probably best viewed as the base case for analysis on the exam. Okay, there's a couple of things to know here. Secured debt just means that it is secured by a specific collateral. So this could be a mortgage bond. Okay, that is a bond secured by some sort of real property. Collateral trust bonds, which just means that there is some specific collateral that stands behind the bond. So if the firm were to default, you don't have to go stand in line with all the other creditors at the courthouse. Okay, you can just go get your asset. Okay, a debenture is a bond that's backed by the full faith and credit of the company, which basically means it's an IOU. It's an unsecured bond. There's no specific collateral. Okay, if you hold a debenture and the firm goes into bankruptcy, well, then you're going to have to make sure you have good representation in the bankruptcy proceedings. So we have debentures. There are senior debentures and subordinated debentures. So the way this works is if you look at the balance sheet of a big company, they will have issued some bonds in 1990 and some more in 1995 and then some in 2000 and 2005, so maybe more often than that. But anyway, they have a history of bond issues that are still outstanding. Generally, which the oldest debentures are the senior debentures. If we were to liquidate the firm, that is in the event of bankruptcy, okay, they would be paid off first and completely, and then we would go to the first subordinated issue. We would pay them off, okay, and then we would keep going down through the subordination hierarchy. And all bonds, of course, remember, have superior claims to both preferred and common stockholder if we're talking about liquidating the firm. What about corporate debt securities? A number of types here. Commercial paper. So this can be anything from 2, which is really on the short end, but no longer than 270 days. Okay, these are pure discount securities. They're not very liquid. There's not a good secondary market for that. They're generally sold through dealers or in some cases by the company themselves. And this is just a corporate IOU. Okay, I will pay you $10 million in 270 days. You buy that today for something less than $10 million. The difference between what you pay for it, and its maturity value is the return that you earn. Okay, my nominee for the worst named security, okay, is a medium-term note. What are medium-term notes? Well, if you just asked me and I didn't know what I was talking about, I would say, oh, they must be kind of medium-term, maybe 10 years-ish, right? Well, anyway, a medium-term note, it has nothing to do with being medium-term. These are continuously offered by an agent, okay? And what that means is if you have a potential buyer, they will call the agent and say, look, I need to create a security that has X maturity. And then you'll go and you'll look at the yield curve and you'll figure out what the coupon rate will be, and there'll be some negotiation and it'll be issued. These have been issued for as short as 9 months time and as long as 100 years. Okay, so 30 plus. These have been issued up to 100 years. Okay, so 100 years, it's certainly hard to think of that as a medium-term note. A variable term note would have been a better description. Okay, but you can also have fixed, you can have floating, or you can have structured securities. A structured security is just a medium-term note combined with some type of a derivative. Okay, and these are often called rule busters. So what you would do is you would issue a medium-term note. And the interest payment would be dependent on oil prices. So somebody needed some exposure to the oil markets, but they couldn't take that directly, so they bought a medium-term note where if oil prices went up, the coupon payments went up. Oil prices went down, the coupon payments went down, and then, of course, the issuer would have to hedge the oil price risk, which isn't a big deal. It's easy to do in the futures market. So we just take those medium-term notes and combine them with a derivative, and we can create just about anything. All right? What about a negotiable CD? So negotiable, okay, so this is also sometimes referred to as jumbo, can be a few days to as long as 5 years. There is a secondary market. So if you're thinking of personal investment, you're thinking of less than $100,000, okay, then you're thinking of a CD, and at the end of the commercial, if you live in the United States, you always hear substantial interest penalty for early withdrawal. Okay, well, that is true, but if you're talking about a negotiable CD, there's a secondary market. So if you buy a 5-year CD, 6 months from now, you decide you didn't want to be in that, well, you can take that and you can sell it. We have that both in US and Euro dollars, okay, issued primarily in London at the LIBOR. Okay, a banker's acceptance, this is just something that's created to guarantee payment for goods that have already been shipped. So essentially, you'll have this invoice. The banker will stamp it accepted. That's when it becomes a banker's acceptance, okay, and then it can be sold as a pure discount short-term note, and there is a big liquidity issue here because there is very little ability to get out of that once you get into that security. What about asset-backed securities? And for an asset-backed security, this is the way I would have thought of this is I would have thought asset-backed securities, and you could have under that you could have mortgage-backed securities and credit card receivable-backed securities and student loan receivable-backed securities and CDOs. Okay, all of that would have come under asset-backed, and that's probably the way it is used in the real world. Okay, but because mortgage-backed securities are such a huge segment of the market, we often talk about those separately. So these are just debt securities that are backed by receivables or financial assets rather than an operating company. So we've obviously done that with many mortgages. We could do it with the paper that backs an auto loan or credit card receivables or anything else. So the firm, what's going to happen is the firm is going to create a special purpose vehicle or an SPV. So let's say you had Sears Roebuck. They're their own credit card issuer, and just as a number, say they've got $500 million worth of credit card receivables on their balance sheet. Well, they're happy that people bought $500 million worth of stuff. They like those receivables, but they need the cash. What they'll do is we'll have Sears. They will open a special purpose vehicle. Okay, they will transfer those receivables to the special purpose vehicle, which is bankruptcy remote, meaning that if Sears were to get into trouble, okay, then they would not, the bankruptcy judge couldn't get at these particular receivables. So we're going to put them in an SPV. The SPV will then issue the asset-backed securities and pass the money from those back up to Sears. So it's a separate legal entity, okay, that's bankruptcy remote, okay, and it is the SPV that actually issues the securities, and it's just like a mortgage-backed security. That is, it's an undivided interest in a pool of receivables. In this case, it's credit card receivables instead of mortgages. Okay, and because of that, the SPV can have a better credit rating than the firm that actually generated the receivables in the first place, which makes this a great way to reduce funding costs and means that firms love to do that. Okay? All right, so what about these asset-backed securities with respect to credit enhancements? Well, there's two kinds, internal and external, but only external enter the discussion at level 1. So an external credit enhancement says, look, these are credit card receivables. So we have credit cards that we gave out to college freshmen. Okay, there's a high default rate on these. So the underlying receivables are questionable. So the people that buy the ABS securities are very credit sensitive. How do we improve the overall credit quality of the issue? Well, we can offer a credit guarantee so whoever was issuing these credit cards could guarantee payment. We could get a letter from our bank where the bank guarantees payment, or the most common way is we could get bond insurance where the bond insurer says, well, we will make good on any losses above X% of the pool. So different ways to enhance the credit quality, and like I said, we'll get to talk more about that at level 2. What about a CDO? Okay, now these are sleepy little securities that probably never will cause any problems. Okay, so collateralized debt obligations, obviously something that in our history now has been in the news. Okay, and this is where we are just collateralizing anything, the kitchen sink, whatever you want to do. Okay, so anything that offers a promise of payment, that can be bank loans, it could be loans from companies in emerging markets, it could be non-performing loans, it could be subprime mortgages, it could be any of that sort of stuff. So it's just we're going to take some receivables and we're going to collateralize them. So this is really a very broad category, all right? So the language here, collateralized debt obligation, could apply to, Ginnie Mae pass-throughs, although generally the idea is that those other more traditional segments are talked about by name. Everything else is a CDO. Two motivations for doing that. One is a balance sheet motivation. I just talked about that with respect to Sears. They had some receivables on their balance sheet. They wanted to convert those into cash. Balance sheet CDOs have caused very few problems in the world. Okay, the other motivation is an arbitrage CDO, and you have to remember that what's happening here is we are buying some receivables. So let's say we buy $100 worth of receivables, and then we're going to put them into a pool and we're going to sell some securities against those. Okay, and if we can buy $100 worth of securities, and we can create $105 worth, we buy $100 worth of receivables and we can create $105 worth of securities, then we have an arbitrage opportunity, right? So it is an arbitrage motivation where we're going to profit from the cash flow spread. So we're going to have, because of the way we can structure these, and we'll see a better example of this at level 2, but we can structure these so that there is some financial alchemy. At least that's what we thought at one point. I still think it does exist, and just maybe not to the extent that we once thought it did, but nonetheless, that's going to increase the value of the securities or decrease the cost of funding, whichever way you want to think of it. So we also do this in different tranches. Okay, they can be based on the seniority of the claims against the underlying assets. That would be a very common way to do it, but we could also tranche out in addition to default losses or defaults, we could also tranche away the timing of the cash flows, just like we talked about with a normal mortgage-backed security as we moved into the CMO discussion. All right. So what about primary versus secondary markets? So this is, of course, something that you're probably familiar with. We see this discussion in the equity section. But a primary market, this is where we sell newly created securities. Several ways we can go about doing that. So the investment banker that is selling these securities can do it under what's called a firm commitment basis. That means that the investment banker purchases the entire issue, and then they take the risk of selling that. Okay, we could also do it on a best efforts basis, which means that the investment banker says, here, we think we can sell it at this price, but we're not going to be the ones that take the risk if it doesn't all sell. The last is called a private placement, or a Rule 144A offering in the United States, where this is where we're going to sell an issue of securities to a fairly small number of investors, okay, and where those investors may meet certain qualifications. And this is something that does not have to be registered and vetted through the SEC. It has to be a notification process, but it's a much streamlined process from a regulatory point of view. Okay, and then after the primary markets, of course, we have the secondary markets. This is a sell from one investor to another, and the value of an asset in the primary markets is critically dependent on the sell in the secondary markets, because if you don't have a secondary market, then the primary market prices are going to be much lower. And that is our discussion here when we're talking about these different sectors of the bond market. There's a lot of terminology there, some intuition, things you probably want to be on top of, but I think it's a fairly easy reading to get on top of. But remember, this is stuff that's going to be embedded into the question, and if you don't understand the background, then you probably won't understand the question. So don't skip over this, or don't take it too lightly is the point.